Greetings, 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 and welcome to day 21 and happy Friday. Woo, we made it through another week, y'all. The week of sacred resistance ancestors. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for showing up, whether you're watching the replay or you're here live. Because 21 days in means we're 21 days in with Black History Month. But we know we lifetime into Black history, and Black history only continues. So this is just an arbitrary marker of Black history because it is continuous, especially for us, for those of us who, are Black. And again, thank you for being here. Today, we are talking about, as we finalize and end this week of working with and honoring sacred resistance ancestors, today we are honoring and connecting with. Now I'm gonna take a deep breath because now I got to work my French side of my mouth. Toussaint Louverture, Dutty Boukman, and Queen Nanny of the Maroons. Now that one's easy. That one rolls off, but I got to get ready for the other ones. And so we're talking about them today as we go to. Yesterday we talked about Prosser and Vesey and Turner, who led uprisings in the U.S. Today, these are the um, people who led uprisings in Haiti, the Haitian Revolution, and in Jamaica. And so, what these ancestors did, Toussaint Louverture and Dutty Boukman and Queen Nanny, the work that they did, the liberation that they fought for, inspired those in the U.S. that happened later, that actually were also the catalyst for making slavery unsustainable here in the US. So we thank these ancestors today. We're going to honor them. And if that's your thing, if that's your jam, and hello, Power Dynamics, thanks for being here. Um, and today, if this is your jam, whether it's, all of the ancestral activations that we've been working through, and there's one more week that we have of doing this work, definitely like, subscribe, and ring the bell so that you know when we go live, and you can either connect with us here live or come back, and that'll remind you to come back and catch the replay, and to connect with your ancestors, with your spirit guides, with your higher self right there on the spot when you get that notification. Use the technology to help you to do things that aren't related to technology as well, like connecting with your own spirit and with your spirit teams, and whatever your spiritual practices are, use this as a reminder to connect in, because that is going to be what sustains us. If there is one overall overarching wisdom that has come from all of these ancestors, is our need, our necessity to stay connected to our spirituality as we navigate these times and what's ahead. And I am Barbara Ohuninifa. I am an author, a coach, and a speaker, and I work with white with Black women to recognize that we are beautiful, to remember that we are powerful, and to be love, to be the love that we seek in others, to be the love that others come to extract or to gain from us. But if we can remember, my belief is that if we can truly remember who we are, and remember who the fuck you are is the title of my most recent book, and I giggle because that's part of the message that my ancestors gave me as I was behaving in a way that was not in honor of who I am, meaning I was letting people, circumstances, life take advantage of me and not standing in my power. And the message they had for me was, you better remember who the fuck you are. And so that's what went into that, the activity book. That's my latest work. And that's the message. And that's at the core of the work I do, helping Black women to remember who we are as descendants of the first woman, the original woman on this planet that gave birth to humanity. Now, that's a big thing, and we have a lot to undo, a lot of toxicity, a lot of hurt and trauma to undo and to cleanse in order for us to stand in the truth of who we are individually. But that's what I'm here for, and that's the work that I do. So if that sounds interesting to you, definitely take a look in the description. There's a link to find out more about my one-on-one coaching. And overall, subscribe to this channel, subscribe to the Medium publication, because that's what I write about, that's what I talk about, and that's, you know, my favorite word. That's my jam. So let's get into it for today. And before I do want to One, say thank you for your grace. This is another day when I am not on camera. Sister had some things I had to just get into, and getting ready for camera was not one of them. And I've mentioned just navigating, chronic health conditions and balancing things so that I can show up consistently to do this work and to share it with you all. Sometimes going off camera is just what has to be, but I'm still here. But thank you for your grace and, not seeing this beautiful face today. And the other thing I want to talk about before I get too far into it. So yesterday I mentioned and talked a little bit about the AI generated image that I used on the thumbnails for that session about the U.S. uprisings and the leaders of that. And this is another AI generated image that I created again because a lot of the images of except for Toussaint Louverture, a lot of them were either definitely Queen Nanny. There was no actual image of her. I mean, she was a master of guerrilla warfare. You weren't gonna know what she looked like. So they were like artist renditions of them. So I just wanted to show something that showed our people victorious and the fact that there was resistance, there was physical resistance in that. And as yesterday, AI had a difficult time creating images that reflected what I wanted it to reflect exactly without adding images of the colonizer in it as well. So that combination of victorious and visuals that indicated things like battle and triumph without and in that same time period, because if I when you contextualize it in the right time period, it kept wanting to put images and flags that indicated the oppressor. In this case, it either wanted to put the French flag or the British flag. And no matter what I did and how I revised the prompt, it would either keep the flag and also have these tools and images of resistance, or it would take away the tools and weapons of resistance if it took away the flag. So this is where the ruling classes have programmed, and we need to deprogram it because AI is not going away. So understanding how to use it and so that we're using it and teaching it. I just got done with it. So in this picture, I just did not include the part that included that French flag and kept it moving. But I wanted to share that because as we continue to use and AI proliferates, as descendants of enslaved Africans, as descendants of these ancestors who fought for us and for our liberation, we have to understand what we're seeing so that we can refute it, so that we can know that what we're seeing is not necessarily and oftentimes not the truth, but a version of the truth from a certain group of people. So just want to leave you with that. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so just yesterday, similar process we're going to do today in that I'll share some of the overall shared context that all three of these ancestors experienced, and then I'll share more about their individual context that led them to being in a position and having the heart to do what they did. So very similar, chattel slavery. This time it's in the Caribbean, and instead of US rule, American government, it was under European rule, specifically the British and the French in the case of these particular ancestors in these locations being Haiti, or at that time, Saint Domingue and Jamaica. And so what did that mean? So all of them, resisted that European colonialism, because mind you, it's not like they were in Europe. In the US, we were on land that people from Europe had come and already claimed as US. So they were already calling it that. They were already had already colonized the indigenous people that were here. In these locations in the Caribbean, there weren't even a lot of European settlers there, but they were claiming it as as their own colonies, as a French colony and as a British colony. And in order to take advantage of the natural resources that were there, they went into Africa, brought our people there, and enslaved us and brought us to the Caribbean. And again, forcibly taken, enslaved very similar, but different groups of European people, because we can still call American like descendants from European, the American white people that. But it was a plantation economy Whereas here we had cotton and indigo and tobacco and a few other things. Their main focus in the Caribbean was sugar, coffee, and rum. And um, to actually manage that production, of course, it was all the enslaved African labor, and the conditions were brutal. We're talking like, you're in the Caribbean, so already the weather and hurricanes and all the things that would happen, but we're really just talking about the brutality of the work itself, and how they punished people and the working conditions. They barely gave them food, barely gave them shelter, barely took care and gave them anything to actually survive. And again, overall inhumane conditions and colonial powers. And again, we're talking about Haiti or Saint Domingue and Jamaica, which was France and Britain. But there's also Spain had actually taken over Jamaica, and then Britain came in and defeated them and took it over. So they fighting against each other over something that ain't neither one of theirs. And so those were the colonial powers that you see throughout the Caribbean. That's why folks speak Spanish, folks speak French, folks speak English, not because that was their native language, it's because those were the colonial powers that came and took over those places and brought Africans there. And now Black people are still there as part of the diaspora. I once heard a woman, I got to take a slight detour, who was from Bermuda. And this is when I was in Costa Rica. And her son, who was, young, less than 5, speaking Spanish, he's speaking English, he's doing all his thing because he goes to school in Costa Rica, and he was telling people that he was Costa Rican, and she said, "No, you're British." Now, mind you, she Black. So she was claiming that colonial power. Like, sis, the only reason why you speak English is because your people were enslaved and that area was colonized. But I just mentioned that, to really bring to the forefront when people want to extract or separate themselves from their African culture, their African heritage in the diaspora, claiming to be, Latino, not Afro-Latino, or not Black. You really got to look deeper at what's happening and the trauma that's caused um, that mental break is what I look at it as. But I digress. Let's get back to it. So these colonial powers, they used extreme violence and they really implemented this racial hierarchy and legal codes. They called them in Haiti, they call them Code Noir, which basically meant black codes. And in the U.S., it was slave codes that were different state by state. But the idea is all of this stripped Black people of our personhood, of our humanity, all so that they could make money to grow European wealth in the case of the Caribbean, to grow American wealth in the case of the United States. This transatlantic slave trade that impacted all of us created racialized economies, meaning all of this was built on the backs of us, of our ancestors. All that we see, all the wealth that we see circulating, well, somewhat circulating amongst a certain group of people, was created um, through Black bodies. Look at all of the wealth in Europe. Look at all of the wealth that is being looted in the US right now. It was made at the expense of African lives and culture. Take a deep breath. So, one of the things I want to mention about Saint Domingue is the high mortality, the brutal working conditions. There was rampant diseases, inadequate living standards. So the mortality rate amongst the enslaved was astronomical, was staggering. So they continuously, meaning slaves didn't make it very long. When they brought them from Africa to, I'm gonna just call it Haiti because that's what we know it as now, even though it wasn't called that back in the day when this was all happening. When they brought slaves to Haiti, they didn't last very long because of the conditions, because of the brutality, because they were killing us. So they kept having to bring in fresh shipments. Now, there's some estimates that over 1 million enslaved Africans died just because of the harsh conditions. We're not even talking about the middle passage and getting here and just any who there was I was about to say any natural causes, but there was not a chance to die of natural causes. But that mortality and having to bring in quote unquote fresh enslaved Africans frequently, the benefit of that was because there were so many coming in constantly directly from the continent, and that constant influx meant that African cultures and languages and religions, spiritual practices remained pretty vibrant because they were constantly getting um, new people in who had just come from the continent who still had that culture as a part of their memory, as a part of their lived experience. So it was constantly getting refreshed. Versus here in the US, when they kind of cut off being able to bring in fresh, and it was just a slightly different system here. We got separated from those that African roots, that African those African cultural aspects over generations. Now, and we'll see as we go through this conversation that in the Caribbean, being able to maintain those African cultures and languages and spirituality meant a difference in how they approach some things and how they approach this revolution. So I wanted to mention that as we go into Toussaint Louverture. Now, he was born into slavery on a plantation in present-day Haiti. And one thing to note about Haiti is that it was, or Saint Domingue, it was the richest colony because of sugar. If you think about sugar and rum, I think there was one other, but sugar and rum were the main two, especially from Haiti and from Jamaica. It's kind of like they were, oh, coffee was the other one. Those three combinations, that's like drugs. And I would not be surprised if that also wasn't, I think I did read somewhere, Christopher Columbus, he was just like the global drug dealer. All the places he was going wasn't because he was this adventurous seafarer. He was going to collect all of the hits that the aristocrats needed and wanted: sugar, coffee, rum, opium. So that was what was happening there, and that was what he was born in. Now, he gained his freedom in his 30s and eventually became, not eventually, it didn't take that long, became a wealthy landowner and actually held slaves himself before he joined the revolution. So he went from being enslaved to being a slave owner to revolting against the whole system. That's a complex trajectory there. So digging into it, how did he get his freedom? So there's this process called manumission, which is just a set of laws and legal frameworks that created a pathway for enslaved individuals to gain their freedom. It wasn't used very often. It was very rare. It was something that was on the books, but it said it maybe happened for every 1,000 slaves, maybe it happened 5 times. And that's probably an overestimation. And there were free people who were mixed African and European. They treated them slightly differently. They had more freedoms than enslaved people who were fully African, but not as much freedom as the straight up Europeans, the white Europeans. But Toussaint Louverture, he was black. By all the information that we've seen is that it was he was, both his mother and his father were full pure African. Now there is this idea, this probably, oh, I'm not rumor, I think it's actually probably true, but that his father was actually a son of a king in what is now present day Benin, suggesting that Toussaint Louverture had royal lineage. Given everything that he did, the amount of education that he had, and what he was granted in terms of latitude, even being able to gain his freedom, and having the trust of his slave owner when he was enslaved, and that allowed him to get his freedom and to use that trust and leveraged it to amass wealth. That to me points to he probably was royalty, and they probably did know that. So that gave him a different leverage in this system. Because if you think about different than the United States or American, white, European, French, and Spain, because they're monarchs, they really valued this concept of royalty. So even though they had no respect or regard for African culture, African people, the fact that in that system he was royalty seems like that gave him a little bit of leverage. So I'm gonna count that as true and keep it moving. Now, let's see. Some of the other things that were relevant for him is that he was influenced by the French Revolution. Just like Prosner was influenced and motivated by the American Revolution, Toussaint was inspired by the French Revolution and these ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which is, represented in the French flag, that, they held for themselves but didn't actually apply it to the enslaved or to other people. It's amazing how that mind worked. Um, and again, the racial hierarchy was something that he grew up in, and that free Black people and mixed race individuals had the limited rights, and enslaved Africans having no rights and brutal oppression. And here, the Caribbean colonizers thought it was cheaper to work a slave 20 hours a day than to replace them when they would die, and then to replace them when they would die. So 5 to 7 years is how long an enslaved African would stay alive in that environment. Whew. Take a deep breath. Thank you for sharing that insight, Dr. Belizaire. And think again about this, the global context. It was a period of revolutionary upheaval. American and French revolutions provided this ideological framework for Black resistance. Now, that's the way history can look at it. If you're into astrology, you understand now the major things that are happening in this, in terms of astrology, specifically Pluto moving into Aquarius, Pluto being revolution, Aquarius being the people in terms of the archetypes that they represent. And this is ancient information. This is ancient insight and wisdom from ancestors all the way back to Kemet. So understanding this, Pluto was in Aquarius the last time all this happened. The last time we had these revolutions, French Revolution, American Revolution, Haitian Revolution. That was the last time Pluto was in Aquarius, and here we are again. Pluto is in Aquarius. So there's a reason that is bigger than how we look back at history. It's really cosmic, that there are just times when the universe, God, all of the names we want to give to this animating force that has set up for major shifts to happen for humanity. It is inevitable. And trust and believe that the people that are doing all of this craziness in the US and across the world from the US, they are very aware of all of this and they plan for it. Have we planned for it? I'm just saying. So, so I have to pause to say his name correctly because I have to go back and correct the meditation because I think I called him Duty. But Dutty Boukman, he was born in West Africa, and again, take a lot of this with an open mind, because one, records aren't always precise and exact, and two, oftentimes they're purposely misleading, or facts are purposely hidden. But what we've seen, and some of the research has shown that he was born in West Africa, specifically what is present day Senegal and the Gambia. Um, or Gambia, sorry. So he was enslaved and transported to Jamaica initially, and he was known for his intellect and literacy. Part of the reason why, in legend, why he got the name Boukman. And there's not a lot of details about his birth, but the suggestion is that he may have been born around 1716. I mean 1767. So again, having been in Jamaica, and then eventually he was sold to Saint Domingue or Haiti. Now, some sources say that that's where he became a voodoo priest. My instinct says that he was already one, that he was born one and probably trained in it before he was even enslaved, captured and enslaved. Um, and again, as a priest and field commander for what would eventually be the Haitian Revolution. And I want to touch for a hot second around what voodoo is. So there's voodoo, which we hear about in Louisiana and in that region, and then there's voodoo, and then there's voodoo. Voodoo has a West and Central African root, so that aligns with where they're saying he's potentially from, and it draws heavily on West African spiritual systems from the Fawn and the Ewe people in the area that is now Benin, Togo, and Nigeria. Vodun is a different practice. So there's voodoo, and voodoo. Voodoo is a different practice that's, I believe, a little bit older than voodoo, and also originating in that area. So once you start to get to trying to splice and dice these things and understand it with I will say, a Eurocentric mindset, whereas these things are much more fluid and evolved over time, and people and tribes and people and individuals migrated, things kind of evolved over time. But the main point I wanted to clarify is that this is a spiritual tradition that comes out of West and Central Africa. This is a spiritual tradition of several from West and Central Africa that was a practice of our ancestors on the continent, one of the practices of our ancestors on the continent. And it's a practice that provides spiritual strength and communal bonds, healing and protection. And the reality is, it's been misunderstood and stigmatized in Western media, associated with black magic and evil and devil worshiping and on all of these negative things. And once we talk further about the Haitian Revolution and you understand the catalyst of it, what set it off and who set it off, Dutty Boukman, you can understand why it was demonized and why it continues to be, because it was a source of power that kicked off the only successful slave uprising on the planet. That's powerful, and they do not want us to have contact with that. So, regardless of what our spiritual practices are personally, understanding and opening your heart to what our people did and how they worshiped, how they looked at nature, how they looked at community, how we looked at the concept of love, and washing away and decolonizing our minds so that we can embrace what is part of us is a part of liberating ourselves. So I just wanted to take a pause for the cause and talk about that for a hot second. But again, voodoo spirituality played a critical role. Bookman had a ceremony, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we go forward. Now, let me get my words right. Boys, Carmen. I just messed it up, and I had practiced it before. Anyway, it's a French word that means alligator woods, and that is where the ceremony took place. And it was again, the spiritual and strategic spark. And Bookman co-led that ceremony with Cecile Fadiman, and we'll talk more about her as well. And so it's important to know that. And then, so Queen Nanny, I know I'm giving a lot of information on this one slide, but we got to get that overall context of what chattel slavery was in the Caribbean versus how we have been taught and understand it to be, and also versus what we know and understand about U.S. system of chattel slavery and what those differences were. Because we're talking about American, Spanish, French, and British colonizers. So we got to remember they were all complicit in this, and they still exist today. Now, Queen Nanny of the Maroons, she was now there's a couple of stories about her origin. There's one, and the more widely accepted is that she was born in Ghana. She was likely a member of the Ashanti people, and who were known for their warrior traditions, and who were known to resist British colonization. And I paused there because they also, in the early years, were complicit in the slave trade and that they sold and kind of participated in it. But that backfired. It didn't take long before they were betrayed and things didn't work out well. But anyway, the story is that she was born there. She was a member of the Ashanti people and was sold into slavery, captured and sold into slavery, and brought to Jamaica. But then she escaped and went into the Blue Mountains, where she became the spiritual and military leader of the Windward Maroons. Now, some of the other versions of her, or the other version of her story, is that she may have been born in Jamaica rather than in Ghana, but she was part of that Maroon community from birth. But she descended from um, royalty, and I say Ghana, it wasn't Ghana at the time, but the Ashanti people. But the other story is that she was born in Jamaica from parents or her father who was royalty in the Ashanti nation, who had been enslaved in Jamaica or brought to Jamaica, escaped, and that she was born there already. Which one is true? We'll never know. Connect with your spirit. But the point is, I think the part that's consistent is that that's her lineage. What is now present day Ghana, or back then I think it would have been the Gold Coast or even the Ivory Coast, depending on which part we're talking about, but that she was Ashanti. And that was her roots, that was her heritage, regardless of whether she was born in Jamaica or in Ghana. Uh, and and that would indicate part of her um, leadership ability, her warrior ability, as well as her spiritual ability. We'll talk more about that as we go on. And so the Maroons were a self-liberated Africans, and they formed this independent community. And they really engaged in spiritual warfare for decades against the British forces. They didn't know what to do with them. The Maroons understood the terrain, they understood and used the natural resources and everything around them, and a little bit of spiritual magic to do what they had to do and to defeat the British. And Queen Nanny in particular, rumor has it, what they had said was that she possessed Obeah powers, which is another form of a spiritual, African spiritual practice that resulted from a root in West Africa, but formed and morphed into something slightly different, basically because he had different environment you were in Jamaica, in the Caribbean. That still exists today. So she used that to protect her people, um, to lead rituals and to strengthen resistance. Now, the British brought in troops to try to crush the Maroon communities because they definitely saw them as a direct threat, but it didn't work. So we'll talk more again as we go forward, but Queen Nanny's leadership was pivotal. There was the first Maroon War, which happened between 1728 and 1739, that resulted in everybody having to come to a table to have a peace treaty because British had to understand that they weren't going to win. So when we look at this big picture, they all face danger. Queen Nanny's life was constantly in danger. A lot of we don't know a lot about her because again, guerrilla warfare, you weren't going to see a lot of her. But that meant she was constantly at risk of death from British forces. But she did what she had to do. Boukman eventually was captured, but he knew that that was going to be a possibility. He did what he had to do. And Toussaint Louverture was eventually captured and went to prison, but he also knew the stakes of what he had to do. So we give thanks to them. As we move on to understand more about what are the acts of resistance that they did. But first, let's talk about this Haitian Revolution. Again, it was between 1791 and 1804, and it was the only successful slave revolt in history. Let that sink in. Humanity, people have been doing horrible things to each other for millennia, all over the planet, enslaving each other for millennia. None as horrific and as pervasive and as long-standing as the enslavement of Africans and dispersing us across the diaspora. None as horrific as that, but people, humanity has been enslaving each other. And this Haitian Revolution was the only successful slave revolt in history. That's powerful. That's big. We know all of the reasons why, the brutality, the harsh working conditions, knowing that you was not going to live. You knew you were going to die. There was no, oh, maybe I can be comfortable and just live out this life and just do this work. They literally were going to work you until you died. They didn't care. So it was either revolt and maybe die standing on your feet, meaning, proverbially on your feet, or die at the hands and at the profit of the oppressors, the colonizers. We know Toussaint Louverture, and we'll talk more about what he did, and we know Dutty Boukman, and we'll talk more about what he did, along with Cecile Fadiman. But one name I did not include in this, which I think is important to mention, Jean-Jacques, and I'm not going to even go with his last name, even though I took 4 years of French. Dessalines, something like that. Jean-Jacques. But anyway, he was the successor to Louverture, and he was the one who actually declared Haiti's independence in 1804. He led a lot of the decisive battles, and he instituted and led the final battle / massacre that eliminated the remaining French presence. So we got to give honor to him as well, because you know Dutty started it, Toussaint continued it, Jean-Jacques finished it. So we give thanks to all of them. And the revolution, again, 1791, the enslaved Africans rose up in a massive revolt. In 1793, France abolished slavery in its colonies because of the revolution's pressures, and they'll claim it was for other reasons too. In 1801, Louverture issued a constitution effectively making Saint-Domingue autonomous. In 1802, Napoleon sent forces to reestablish control and reinstate slavery. That didn't work out for him. In 1804, they were victorious. The enslaved Africans were victorious over the French forces, which led to the declaration of Haiti's independence. Now, the impact, Haiti became the first Black republic in the world and the second independent nation in the Americas. They challenged these global systems of slavery and colonialism, inspired slave uprisings, as we talked about yesterday in North America, but it also led to international isolation and economic hardship because the West retaliated and are still retaliating. They're sore losers on steroids, massively, galactic sore losers. With the economic sanctions and just overall isolation. I'm pausing because it's just to see and understand what's been done. And then they chalk it up to, I think it's, I forget the guy's name, but the white pastor at 700 Club, basically talking about they're being punished by God. No, they're being punished by the European oppressive forces and will retaliate forever. Because they lost hold that they know created a ripple effect that's still rippling through time. So they're going to continuously try to punish and retaliate, but we're going to lift them up and give them thanks because we know what they did for all of us. And part of what happened and what that did, that this Haitian Revolution, it forced France to abandon their ambitions. Because let me tell you, Napoleon had plans. He was coming for U.S. He had part of the U.S. That facilitated the Louisiana Purchase. So he sold what holdings that the French had and what is now part of the United States. He sold it to the United States because he was like, okay, nope. But understand the impact and the influence of French and some of these Haitian traditions that are in Louisiana and that region, and then blending with other Europeans that came there. It's a very unique experience, and part of that is the history of why. And so, yeah, the Haitian Revolution is a major thing that, we should be understanding and looking at as key to our own liberation. Well, the version and stage of liberation that we're in, because we ain't completely free, y'all. So let's talk about Toussaint Louverture and his role as that strategic revolutionary. He was a master of strategic alliances, and all of this was that political maneuvering and military leadership, which is also why I really do believe he was royalty, because his understanding of things and the training he was actually able to get and the influence he received and just how he moved, as we'll talk about, speaks of royalty, speaks of someone who was bred to be able to maneuver in this kind of way. So these strategic alliances, initially he aligned with Spanish forces against the French, leveraging, Spain had this promise that they were going to let all the enslaved people free that joined their side. Now, rewind a little bit, and we'll talk about that more when we get to Queen Nanny. Um, when Spain was colonizing or had colonized Jamaica, and the British came in because then they wanted it and they battling. Spain released all their prisoners, and that is part of all of their slaves, and that's part of what initially formed the Maroon community. Because when they released their enslaved, they went into the bush, they went into the mountains, and that made the initial group of the Maroons there. And so, in dealing with Haiti, they said, "Hey, come and join us and fight. We'll let y'all free." I don't know if that would have actually been true, but when Toussaint saw that there were some political shifts happening, he was able to see that happening. He switched allegiances to the French Republic after it abolished slavery in 1794. Because, mind you, you got the French Revolution happening, so you got the French fighting against the French. So he joined the side that was going to help with the abolition of slavery and positioned himself as a leader in that. And he negotiated with both British and French governments to help ensure some economic stability for the colony while also fighting foreign forces. That allowed him to outmaneuver some powerful European empires. That's somebody who was bred for this type of leadership, who understood this on that level, who understood what it meant to negotiate and to maneuver between imperialistic powers. And as commander of the Revolutionary Army, he orchestrated guerrilla attacks, scorched earth strategies, and he fortified the colony. And all of that effectively helped defeat the British and Spanish invasions. So scorched earth is an interesting strategy. And it basically meant I'm going to burn down everything so you can't use it against me, which is a military strategy. So every time the French or even the British, anytime any of them would try to come in, because they were all fighting. Because think about this colony, this land, the production of the resources on that land, primarily sugar, but you also had some rum and some coffee, made it the most lucrative. So all these European powers were just salivating because they wanted that money. I mean, think about all of these people, and still today, 100% motivated by capitalism, and all they saw was the riches and the treasures they were going to get from that space. So they were fighting each other for it. And he used scorched earth. He's like, "Oh, you want this? How about we burn it all and you got nothing? How about we burn it all, and as you bring in your troops, you got nothing to house yourselves. You have nothing to feed yourselves. You have no resources that you can use off of this land that's already here to sustain your forces to fight us. Invading forces are not going to be able to use any of it for supplies or shelter." That was a major strategy that helped him repel these forces. And even burning of the plantations had a symbolic purpose. It struck at that economic core, just like we talked about Tupac, who sued the Oakland Police Department, which is unprecedented at the time, and got paid. Not a huge amount, but it hit them in the pocket because that's what they care about. Or just like Mary Pleasant, who sued the San Francisco streetcar, which we talked about during Sacred Shields, sued them, got money. Or just like Ida B. Wells, who sued the Tennessee Railway, got paid. Tennessee Supreme Court overturned it. But all of these methods to hit them what they care about, which is money, capitalism, that was symbolic and it was impactful, not only hitting them where it hurts because they couldn't come and, there was going to be nothing left for them to come and benefit from, but also for the enslaved Africans to be able to burn down something that had caused them so much pain and suffering. That was a part of so much pain and suffering. I mean, the work, the land itself and the products produced from the land didn't cause the suffering. It was the people trying to benefit and capitalize on that. So it all had a major impact. And of course, fortifying the colonies and doing all of the things to protect. And the fortifications made it difficult for those European powers to hold territory. They had to engage in drawn out, costly battles in unfamiliar conditions that they weren't equipped for. As I mentioned earlier, briefly, the environment, the weather, the humidity, all of the things that make the Caribbean, those conditions did not exist in Europe. So these warriors, these soldiers, European soldiers, were not accustomed to this. And Toussaint capitalized on that. And he also, having put that constitution in place. So this is also a broader understanding of strategy and long-term thinking. It wasn't just the battle that had to happen now to get free, to actually liberate ourselves. We need to have something in place after to govern us, to create a new institution. Now, there's arguments or criticisms around what that constitution entailed, and especially in terms of himself naming himself the governor for life. Bruh, I don't know if that's exactly democracy, but we're moving things along now. And in that, he maintained the plantation labor systems, but under pay. There's also criticism for that. Like, why not undo the whole plantation system? And he was pragmatic in the thought that we have to have something to sustain ourselves. We actually have to produce something. So he was thinking about it in terms of that. But also, we can pay people for doing what they're doing and take away the brutality, take away the mistreatment, so people can actually do this and live at the same time. So we thank him for all of the strategic visionary leadership that he provided, both on the battlefield and in terms of politics and the longer term vision that we were going for. Now, Dutty Boukman, I'm going to pause every time I say that so I can get it right. He, as that, spiritual incendiary, he was the catalyst of the revolution. So there was a ceremony, Booz, Boy Kaiman. I'm so upset with myself. I have been saying it and now I'm like, wait, what? Because I'm talking and going in the flow. But the point is, there was a location in the woods, in the Alligator Woods, where the ceremony took place in August, along with Cecile Fadiman, and they together led this voodoo ceremony, and that was a spiritual and organizational launch of the Haitian Revolution. So Toussaint Louverture, again, he was wealthy, he owned slaves. He wasn't part of the people, one of the people who kicked off the Haitian Revolution, but he joined it and started doing, leading it. Dutty Boukman, damn it, I did it again. Dutty Boukman led it, the actual campaign, the actual military campaign, the initial part of it, but kicked it off spiritually with Cecile Fadiman. So during this ceremony, this kickoff, there were oaths of unity. There were rituals that invoked ancestral spirits to bless the rebellion, to fight with them spiritually. And it really represented a reclamation of African spirituality because I understand Christianity and Catholicism were getting pressed down on this population, but the fact that they kept bringing in um, newly enslaved Africans meant that the African spiritual traditions and culture kept getting refreshed. And there was also something that was called the Boukman prayer. And it's gone, exact words, of course, been lost through translation and over time. But the overall theme is that he condemned the God of the whites because they used all of the selected passages in their Bible and in their Christianity that they could to sanction slavery. And for Bookman, he said, no, that's not our God. If your God is the God that says that, that's not the God that created the sun and the moon and the mountains and the nature that we're all a part of. Our God wants freedom and justice. And this was theological resistance, rejecting those colonial religious narratives. Now, I want to touch base and talk a bit about Cecile Fadiman because she was a pivotal figure. And as a woman, she's often um, undermined or minimized in that. And I might, after this 28-day, do a session on her in particular because she is often minimized. So I want to speak to her and talk about the role that she had and a little bit about who she was. So the idea is that she was born, idea because who actually knows the details, but she was born in the 18th century. Her mother was an enslaved African woman and her father was a white Frenchman. Some say that he was a Corsican prince and may have been linked to King Theodore of Corsica. But it's overall, it doesn't, whoever he was, he still sold her and her mama into slavery in Haiti, Saint Domingue, with full knowledge that they probably weren't going to live because enslaved Africans didn't survive. Her two brothers were separated from them and they disappeared, and there's no indication of what happened to them. And, you know, of course, with a French father and an African mother, she's was said to have green eyes and long silky hair. They love to emphasize certain aspects of Europeanized beauty. What's important to me is that her mama was African. I mentioned this a few days ago that as a mother is educated, so too are her children. Let that sink in. So she was right alongside, I'm gonna just say Bookman, because that Dutty just keeps like throwing me off. She was right alongside, and it is said that she became possessed by the goddess Ursuli. Now, to understand being possessed by a goddess is the same thing as your grandmama getting the Holy Ghost in church, or any of the Christian black church scenarios where the women get overtaken by spirit or start speaking in tongues. It is the same thing. And there's also a reason why it's usually women as well, black women. So sit with that for a moment. But in this case, in this particular goddess, Ursuli, was, I mean, all of these energies are somewhat warriors because they're about liberation. They're about serving the people and protecting the people, but also love, 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 love. So keep that in mind. And so calling on ancestors, bringing through this goddess, understand, and you know, they talked about there's being a ritual sacrifice of a black pig. Understanding also when animals are sacrificed, they're sacrificed every day. Every time you eat Popeye's chicken, an animal has been sacrificed for that. In these African cultures and the African spiritual traditions, when an animal's life is given to protect or to provide energy to something, it's not this barbaric thing that, for instance, what was done to Nat Turner. It is to provide an energy because that animal's life has a life force energy that can be used and offered to help protect and sustain the human beings that are doing the work. And the animal itself is often cooked and used to feed the community. So what's different than the Popeye's chicken is that the Popeye's chicken wasn't prayed over. It didn't die for any other purpose other than capitalism. In African spiritual traditions, and I'm not talking about anything dark, because any and everything can be turned dark. I'm talking about done in light and love and liberty, and done for the benefit of people and families and communities. Praying over an animal, thanking it for its sacrifice, and cooking and eating it as a community was natural thing to do, and nothing scary to be demonized the way media and European powers have demonized it. So I just want to to touch base on that. Now, she later in life married a revolutionary, a leader, a general in the Haitian Revolutionary Army, who later became president. But they had a daughter and then they got divorced. But it said that she lived crazy long, like she lived to the age of 112. To let that sink in. Her daddy sent her and her mama to Saint Domingue, expecting that they probably would not live because enslaved Africans did not live. And she lived to be 112 years old. So she survived the Haitian Revolution. Take a deep breath. We give thanks to Mama Cecile and her partnership and her work and her spiritual power. And we give thanks to her mama and her mama's mama and all the mothers who gave birth to all the mothers in her maternal line. The other thing I want to point out too with this spiritual ceremony that launched the Haitian Revolution, that launched the only successful slave uprising on this planet, that it took masculine energy and feminine energy. It took co-leading from a man and a woman. Unlike many of the civil rights or liberation efforts that have taken place on U.S. soil, where Black women have been minimized or excluded, and only some level of success was had or no success, the Haitian Revolution provides us also with a blueprint that we needed both equally to do what it do. And I think that's an insight that has been lost on people because misogynoir is such a thing. That intersection of racism and sexism the Black women experience exists still today. And as we talked about with some of the leaders in the resistance, like Mama Fannie Lou Hamer, her own people, her own civil rights movement tried to minimize her because she was a dark-skinned Black woman who came from poverty. Or Zora Neale Hurston, who was ridiculed by other quote unquote conscious folks from the Harlem Renaissance because she was a Black woman who spoke and wrote about experiences of rural Black people. So I'm just saying, explore that and understand we might need to do things, ain't no might, we need to do things a little different. And that's been the wisdom that's been coming through all week. Center Black women, center Black women's voices, center Black women leadership. You need it. We need it. It's been the missing component. All right, I'm on a soapbox. Let me keep going. Um, so the theological resistance, we talked about that. You know, I went in on Mama Cecile Fadiman, and we give thanks. And Dutty Boukman, in partnership with her, implemented this theological resistance. And after they had that ritual, after that kickoff, he led the charge. He led and coordinated that armed uprising. And of course, it involved, not of course, but it involved mass arson, targeting sugar plantations. Again, they went for the money. They crippled the economic resources, the economic backbone. Uh, he knew what was coming. I'm almost certain it had been prophesized what was going to happen to him, but he knew he had to do it anyway. It was divine. It was ordained. He had to do it. So they captured him and they beheaded him. And we'll talk more about what they did. What so far in terms of the research or what was documented, it doesn't seem that they were as horrific as the people here in the US and what they did to Nat Turner, but it was pretty horrible. So we give thanks to all of the people, all of the leaders, all of those who took up the mantle, those who started it, Dutty Boukman, those who continued it, Toussaint Louverture, and Jean-Jacques, who finished it. We give thanks, and we give thanks to Cecile Fadiman, who brought in the divine feminine energy that made it all work. And then we have Queen Nanny, the warrior leader, whose background and origins are mysterious, but as a guerrilla leader, of course it's going to be. Now she was instrumental, and by instrumental, I mean she was the catalyst and the leader of that Maroon War, the first Maroon War. Her military tactics, her military leadership was she was a mastermind at it. She had it was a difficult terrain. The Blue Mountains in Jamaica make the best coffee, but it is a thick terrain. And I could imagine, I've seen it in recent years. I could only imagine what it was like uh, back in the day. But she conducted these ambushes, hidden run attacks, surprise raids on British troops and plantations, confused them because they didn't understand. Like her people would come almost out of nowhere because they knew how to they worked with the land, they worked with the natural resources, they worked with what was around them, and they would almost come out of nowhere, attack, and then disappear back into nowhere. People and British soldiers were so confused and frustrated. So under her leadership, they disrupted plantation economies, liberated enslaved Africans, destroyed crops, and weakened the British colonial power. And she was not only a military leader, but she also was a spiritual figure, and that she was a priestess. Now, some say that she, whether it was Obeah, which was a more localized version, and I'm giving my understanding of it with all due respect. I don't practice voodoo or Obeah or Okom, but I respect and understand the origins of all of it. So any words that I'm saying or anything that is not precisely accurate as a practitioner, I give thanks and I give honor to all these practices because I see the impact they had on us being where we are now. And so whether she practiced Okom or Obia uh, is unclear, and as well it should be, because again these things are blended. We can't necessarily put them in these neat categories. Um, but being the spiritual leader, she also had prophetic abilities, much like Nat Turner had prophetic abilities. And there's rumors that she could catch a bullet with her teeth. And I say rumor because, that unless someone who actually saw it and documented it and took picture of it, which we know none of that existed at the time, somebody is always going to refute it. Is it possible? Anything's possible. And no one thought the Haitian Revolution was going to be possible, but it happened. We know, and we'll talk more next week as we talk about restoration, there have been documented instances of miraculous healings and supernatural things that defy explanation. So could she catch a bullet in her teeth? Maybe. And these supernatural powers and her ability to prophesize added to her retaining the culture of the Ashanti people. And we'll talk next week as we go into again to sacred restoration, holding on to and reinvigorating your cultural traditions that are your traditions, not that have been forced upon you and adopted from the oppressor, is a form of psychological resistance, is a form of healing. And the fact that she, with her and her people, Maroons in the Blue Mountains, maintaining some of those traditions that she either brought with her from Ghana or that her father taught her if she was born there, whichever scenario of her origin we go with, keeping that alive enabled them to stay psychologically strong, to keep this fight going. Overall, the British were fighting the Maroons for 80 years. Do you understand that? 80 years. The official war was 1729 to 1728 to 1739, but they had been fighting for decades prior to that. There has to be a psychological and spiritual strength in order to resist for that long, to keep going for that long. So we thank her for that. And as a community organizer, she she freed Africans. So it's almost like Queen Nanny was a combination of many different people. She had a little bit of Harriet Tubman in her. She had a little bit of Nat Turner in her. She had a little bit of Prosser in her. She had a little bit of all of the different components that are necessary for us to remember who we are and to fight for our liberation. Um, and she made sure, and which we'll talk about with this diplomatic influence that she made sure that there was some um, self-sufficiency and autonomy for her people. They were even, when she brought them the newly freed slaves, or rather the newly freed enslaved Africans, because no one is born a slave, where they lived in the Maroon community, it was called Nanny Town. And if you look into her further, she's on Jamaican money. There's statues and busts related to her. She is honored in that society, in that environment as well. She should be. Now, the diplomatic influence, because of this war, 80 years and then intensified with officially being a full-on Maroon war, that just let the British know that they needed to negotiate. And so they came to the table. That resistance made it where they had to negotiate because they had to admit, no matter how cocky they were, that they could not defeat the Windward Maroons militarily. Now, I think this may be also, not maybe, likely, another instance of, and I'll talk about the treaty in a second, because we know the difficulties, the economic difficulties that Jamaica has. Now, they didn't get um, the retaliation as badly as Haiti did, but they definitely got some. Anywhere that the colonizers, imperialism lost ground, they came back even stronger in different ways, full force, to inflict harm on those who were just trying to live their Black lives. Now, this treaty basically recognized the Maroons' autonomy and that they had a right to land. The unfortunate part was that it required the Maroons to stop attacking plantations and to stop freeing slaves, basically, to help capture slaves is where it eventually kind of evolved to. But one thing in some historical accounts suggest, and I can believe it, she refused to sign it. She personally did not sign that treaty. Another Maroon leader signed the treaty. And I could imagine she was, yeah, I'm gonna do what we need to do. Y'all can do what you need to do to guarantee our survival, but I'm not obligated to that shit. So I'd imagine she probably kept doing what she was doing on some levels. And that was a significant thing because it recognized the autonomy of the Maroons and gave them land rights and acknowledged their freedom, making it one of the earliest forms of Black sovereignty and the earliest formal recognition of Black sovereignty in the Americas. But again, the fact that it meant that they had to stop harboring newly escaped enslaved Africans and assist the British in suppressing future slave rebellions. That was a complex dynamic. And again, if I were to lean into what her mind state might have been, I would have refused to sign it as well. Let somebody else sign it so we can play both sides of that. But we give thanks to her for keeping the culture alive, keeping the mind and the mental state, the connection to who we are truly as a people alive, to survive in the lush Blue Mountains of Jamaica for nearly a century while under attack took a level of community connectedness and togetherness that is an African slash Black mentality, way of being, ethos in the world. Very different than what our oppressors do and how they maneuver. And we thank her. So we've talked about what they've done. We've talked about what these leaders have have really embodied spiritual leadership and preservation of our languages and of our culture. But how did they stay convicted? Spiritual conviction and personal discipline. Now, the spiritual conviction, I think, applies to all of them. The personal discipline, actually, it really applies to all of them as well. But initially, when I wrote this, I thought about what I was seeing about Toussaint Louverture. He was known, he had a nickname, the Black Spartacus, because he was pretty stoic and he had personal discipline that was unwavering. He didn't drink alcohol. He had a strict moral code. He had a real clear way of governing himself and his life. And we all know the importance of discipline if you're trying to achieve a goal, if you're trying to understand and navigate a world, having some level of personal discipline is key, but also the spiritual conviction. And for him in particular, it gave him this moral authority that his followers really were enamored by. But the discipline and conviction, spiritual conviction and personal discipline were key aspects of what kept them going. And African spiritual unity, as we saw and understand through Boukman and Queen Nanny and Fadiman, was a key part of that. So voodoo is sacred resistance. That voodoo cosmology, again, he was a priest. He was a priest in this cosmology, which meant that he had not only an understanding and a training on how to wield the energy and what to do and how to do it, but he also had the ability to unite different African ethnic groups. Because again, all of these ethnic groups had their own version of a spiritual system, but they all had a lot of similarities. They all came from a similar root. I won't reduce it to say they came from the same root, but they all had similar ways of looking at their place and our place in the world, in the cosmos, and in nature. The enslaved Africans, the Africans that were there to fight for their unity, that were there and wanted to fight for their unity and for their liberation, understood that. So he was able to unite these different tribes, these different peoples with shared spiritual beliefs and love for unity. That was powerful. And I believe a key part of why it was effective. And looking at Voodoo and Akam and Obeah as revolutionary forces, they brought it all together. Queen Nanny and Fadiman and Boukman, they brought that all together, uniting enslaved people who were deliberately trying to divide us. Well, the enslaved people weren't trying to divide us. The colonial powers were trying to divide the enslaved people. And so looking at the idea of practical healing as well as psychological warfare and all of the rumors about what they were able to do and catching bullets and all these other things, it gave this aura of invincibility, but also quite likely a truth of invisibility. And yeah, and there's some talk about Queen Nanny with her prophetic powers. Part of the reason why they were able to work so effectively in their guerrilla warfare is because she could foresee the British ambushes. She knew it was coming before it came. So they were prepared every time. I'm just saying. African spiritual unity was a critical part in what was the foundation that led to our freedom here later and on a whole different continent. Something to think about. And community and collective identity. Everything about how they all worked was about community cohesion. None of these were quick, mad dash type of rebellions. It had to be sustained over years, and you cannot do that without a deep sense of community, without everyone knowing who they were and what they stood for, individually and collectively. The disciplined military approach of Louverture, Boukman's spiritual unity, Mama Queen Nanny's nurturing leadership, All of that created communities of resistance, not just armies. Unlike the European forces, these were soldiers that were sent into war most likely for pay, because that's the only thing they cared about. These people, our people, were fighting for their families alongside their families. We're fighting for each other. We're fighting to exist. That's a whole different motivation that will take you so much further. And as always, love. Love was leadership for all of them. Love, Laveau had love for the collective future of his country, Saint Domingue, aka Haiti. It made him want to pursue autonomy and stability and look long term about have the generations to come. So he created a constitution. And maybe he didn't trust anybody else, which is why he named himself governor for life. And then there was the ceremony that Boukman co-led and the call to arms. That was a spiritual covenant, affirming that freedom was a sacred right. Love for freedom, sacred love for our ancestors, for future generations. They knew they were fighting for more than just this moment. Only love can have you do something like that. You ain't getting nothing in the meantime. Only a deep love, a divine love, a spiritual love can have you lead in that way. And Queen Nanny, her whole role was about nurturing her community. And don't get it twisted. The word nurturing can have us thinking about real soft things, although it does include that as well, because that's balance. But nurturing could mean part of the discipline, could mean you gonna get your ass up and train so that if you are running or if you are getting away from these British forces or you need to learn your environment, like you're gonna know what you need to do because I love you and I want you to survive. That's what a mother does. A mother's gonna give her children all the things that they need to live, survive, and thrive. And that was what she did for her community. That was love. And again, these weren't just warriors. This was family. This was community. Love is what made resistance possible and what made it necessary. Ooh, this one is going long. I guess I'm feeling this. We're not talking as fast. But it's things that we need to know. So we're gonna keep it going. All right. So um we know the things that they've done and the impact they had, the strategies that they used, which were just brilliant, multi-dimensional strategies that were both practical, spiritual, and steeped in love, and highly strategic and long-term thinking. And of course, we've talked about how these forces have retaliated. These forces of colonization and imperialism retaliated. So let's talk about how they attempted and in some ways have erased or distorted Louverture's, Boukman, and Queen Nanny's legacies. So these colonial narratives painted voodoo leadership and anything that is African spirituality as devil worship. Still to this day, I can remember being a kid and watching black and white movies. And listen, there was color TV, but black and white movies were also still very prevalent on TV back then. And I used to like to watch Abbott and Costello. Do you know how many times they would show like some black voodoo uh medicine man or something crazy, and they would just make it look really evil. And that would be right next to some black man with bucked out eyes that was just scared of everything. They used media, and media was a major form of propaganda, but they used all of that, the movies, the shows, all the things that they could to demonize and suppress our spirituality, thinking back to it was that spirituality that gave us the strength and the clarity on how to move forward. And then just minimizing it. Louverture's his political prowess and his vision have been overshadowed by other narratives that focus purely on his military aspects. This man was brilliant. He looked long term and short term. What do we need to do now, and how do we need to prepare for the future? And then Queen Nanny's contribution, and I even almost did it with Mama Fatima's contributions, sideline and historical accounts, downplayed the role of women in revolutionary leadership. And now, as I'm saying that, I'm definitely going to do something on Mommy Fatima later, because I don't want to contribute to this mentality of minimizing the contributions of Black women. So she gonna get her own situation. Oh, next month in International, what is it? International Women's Month and International Women's Day. We're gonna talk about Fatima, Mama Fatima. Okay. And then there was the educational erasure. Nobody talks about all of this. I do not remember until I got to a historically Black college hearing anything about a Haitian Revolution. Nothing, zip, zero. We can't let it go. We can't let them erase it. And we know, again, I keep bringing this up, all of this stuff is on the table now. They're trying to take it even further. They're trying to truly erase it. They're trying to make sure their own little kids don't know anything. I mean, they don't anyway, about our history. They're trying to for damn sure make sure we don't, because there's power in that. And then, collective punishment. And we, talked a little bit about the backlash on both Haiti and Jamaica, even though the Haiti backlash was even more pervasive and continues. But this punishment where during that time period where entire communities, enslaved, Maroon alike, faced annihilation if any resistance leaders were discovered. And we talked about yesterday in the US how they obliterated hundreds and hundreds of Black people after those uprisings, Black people who didn't have anything to do with the uprising, obliterated, AKA murdered, unalived, all the things. And you could imagine how brutal and inhumane and horrific and the carnage was. And same thing in the Caribbean with having this collective punishment to send a message. And then there was overall the cultural suppression, because yes, Dr. Belizaire, they don't want us to know how strong we are. They know, which is why they're doing all of these things to suppress us now in 2025. They know, but they don't want us to know. And they don't want poor white people or people coming in from other countries like Latino or Asian or Indian, any other cultures in the world to know. And when we talk about this suppression of educational erasure or cultural suppression, that happens globally. There are people who grow up in other countries who know nothing about any of this either. They don't know anything about Black people. They just know the propaganda that they're given, which is why many of them come here with the same mentality as their own oppressors as well, their own imperialists as well, because they've been fed the stories from the same media factory. So they look at us in the same way as our white oppressors look at us. And the military retaliation, we talked about that. The French sent massive military expeditions to try to crush the uprisings. It didn't work though. British waged decade-long wars. Didn't help though. Now you could just imagine how much money that cost them, and I'm sure they calculated it, and that was part of what was infuriating with them. Not only were they not making money in these areas that they had been with extracting all of their wealth from, it was costing them money to send military, and then they have to keep sending military because the forces of uprising were crushing them, which is why we see the economic impact and sanctions now that still affect the economies of these countries. And their trusted standby, mutilation, and overall terror. When they captured Boukman, they beheaded him and displayed his head to try to instill fear or demoralize and to stop the uprisings. displayed it, took it on, made it so that everyone could see their esteemed leader's head on a stick or on a stake. But it didn't work. It strengthened the resolve. This is how one of the reasons why I say it was probably prophesized, excuse me, it was probably prophesized when they had that ritual. When because a ritual is not just, oh, we're going to sing and dance. There's things, there's messages. Ancestors speak, spirit speaks. Understanding what was to come was part of what that ritual was. So they probably all knew that was going to happen. So seeing it happen invigorated the fight. Seeing their leader in that way strengthened them. So what the French thought was going to deter actually strengthened. So the mutilation and terror in their attempt did not work in that case. So let's get to the wisdom. It's been an in-depth. Well, it makes sense. This was the foundation of all of the resistance that we've been talking about all week. This is what motivated, this is what inspired, bit by bit, everyone, all the way back to, I think the most contemporary one we can speak to is Tupac. Every sacred resistance ancestor we've talked about this week was inspired by the work of these people. And this is me justifying to myself why this particular session is so long. It's important. So let's talk about what this wisdom and how we can use it and think about it today. Toussaint Louverture, his whole wisdom and lesson is around the idea that freedom requires visionary leadership and strategic action. He taught us that a successful resistance demands that we be disciplined and have a long-term vision. And that we must, as we think about liberation and governing ourselves after liberation, we have to be thinking about a sustainable plan for self-determination. This is not unlike what everyone else has been talking about. By everyone else, I'm talking about the ancestors. We got to fight for now and then have a plan for after. We got to get free and then we have to have a way to sustain ourselves, because you ain't free if you still got to depend on the oppressive system to live, to feed yourself and your family. We have to use a multidimensional approach. And then how do we apply that? We build these movements with clear structure, long-term strategies, and ethical leadership, good character. All of these spiritual traditions, at the core of them, these African spiritual traditions, and even at the core of what was originally Christianity, the Christianity that started in Ethiopia, not the one that's been used to do horrific things across the world and to wage wars and crusades. But these spiritual traditions, at the core of all of them, have this idea of good character, of being in alignment with what is light, what is right. In cases where we have an issue with ethical leadership, it's because people have adopted, and I've said this multiple times, the mentality of our oppressors. People misunderstand what leadership actually means. It's not being in control of people. It's not being in charge of people. It's not people praising and looking up to you and dumballying to you. This is a word where you basically are, almost curtsy or bowing to a leader in certain African traditions. These people showed us what leadership meant. All of the people this week have shown us what leadership meant. All the people last week showed us what leadership meant. At its core, it's love for the people. When you have that, to me, naturally, ethical leadership will follow. And then we need to develop political, economic, and social blueprints. And once liberation actually is realized, yes, serve your people, to serve your people, servant leadership. Because at the end of the day, if you're leading your people, you're doing so in alignment with God. You're doing so in alignment with divine inspiration, which means you're serving God. You're serving your higher self. You're serving humanity. It's like a reciprocal, circular type of thing. Thank you for that. And so we have to look beyond resistance. There's a fight that has to happen. It's, the short term, the midterm, and the long term. And pulling in experts so that when we create what's next, as we create what's next, it's not a repeat of what we just came out of. It's not repeating what has been modeled for us that has not worked for the last 200 plus years or 500 plus years, or what came out of these European monarchies. We have to understand and look at all the different time periods, all the different lessons from the different models, and extract what worked, understand what worked, use critical thinking to understand how do we build our future? Where do we want to go? Dutty Boukman, his wisdom would be around the understanding that liberation begins when fear ends. To me, that encapsulates the idea of spiritual awakening and revolutionary unity. The combination of those, when you're awake spiritually, and I don't mean that the bastardization of the word woke that's being used in politics now, but truly a spiritually awakening at whatever levels, because I don't believe spiritual awakening is one event. It's a progression. It's a spiral. With each level, you awaken a little bit more to who you truly are, to your divine self. And as you do that, fear drops away and the idea of unity takes its place. That in of itself is revolutionary. His leadership in that ceremony that launched the Haitian Revolution, it wasn't just about him. It was collective. It started with a spiritual ritual and ceremony because that's where the inspiration came from. That's where the direction came from. That is what the action was propelled from. And how do we apply that today? This letting fear go and leaning into unity and leaning into our own spiritual awakening, which all will lead us to liberty. We embrace and honor the cultural and spiritual practices of our ancestors as sources of resistance and strength. That does not mean we need to not be or practice Christianity, that we need to abandon the Black church. What it means is that we need to be open. Because the reality is, for those of us in the United States who are descended from enslaved Africans here, the Black church is also part of our ancestral spiritual practice. And we cannot ignore them. That's the last 400 years that had us survive on this land, this phase of our experiences as human beings. So we don't ignore them and we don't abandon what helped them survive what they were in. We become inclusive because there's a lot that a lot of us will reject anything African. I've even heard some people say things like, usually nobody in our generation, usually somebody's mama, their grandmama, that thankful for slavery because it took us out of Africa. What kind of colonized ass mind is that? I could have some compassion and understand how it got there, but I don't know if my compassion is best used in that scenario. And then there are those who want to ignore everything that is African American, everything that has to do with the South, everything that has to do with the Black church and all the things that sustained us here, and act like they are only African, but they was born in Detroit. My point is with this is that we have to look at the totality of what all levels and stages of our ancestors have been through and what spiritual practices sustained them, and open our hearts and minds to all of that. Because those ancestors are with us. They riding with us right now. And they're like, oh, what, you just gonna diss what I did? That's the thing that helped you, all of it. And then recognizing that revolution starts with your mind and your spirit. It starts with the decolonization of your mind, which is part of what we're going to talk about next week and starting tomorrow, actually, with sacred restoration. It's your mind, your body, and your spirit, freeing it. And not in that order. Mind and spirit, we can kind of dance between the two of those. The freedom and the liberation of your body is the last thing that comes. And that's part of the issues. Technically, our bodies have been free, but our minds and spirits have still been colonized and enslaved. And Bookman and Fadiman show us that the road to freedom begins when we believe in our inherent power and we unite in purpose and spirit. That's what they're trying to take away from us, our belief and understanding of who we are and our power, and how that power is amplified exponentially when we're in unity. A bunch of Black people who know what they are and know their individual gifts and in alignment with their own spirits, that love each other, that love God, that love humanity, and are united towards a common goal, you can't do nothing with that. And they know that. But that's what we got to try to achieve. That's what we must achieve. And Queen Nanny, her wisdom would explain to us that freedom is preserved through cultural survival and community defense. This taps into a little bit of that embracing and honoring all aspects of our culture, all the way back to the motherland, the continent, and inclusive of the diaspora, inclusive of Brazil and Jamaica and Haiti and all of the other ports in the Caribbean and along the way where Africans were taken to create wealth for other countries. And I use the word womanist in particular because it is rather than feminist, I'll just quote Alice Walker. She developed that term. Womanist is to feminist as is purple is to lavender. And I've made some illusions and comments around feminism and the feminist movements, and even the women's suffrage movement didn't really include Black women. When we start to look at womanist, that specifically talks about our liberation as Black women, but also is inclusive. Because again, said this, Black women sitting at that intersection of race and gender, and oftentimes class and poverty, means that as we liberate, it benefits everyone else, every other woman, every other ethnicity and culture, because race is a construct, every other socioeconomic class. Queen Nanny showed us that that womanist leadership and cultural resistance can carry us forward. It can be the key to us um, having the knowledge of self and knowledge of power to move forward. And again, as a woman is educated, so are her children. So how do we apply that and how do we implement that? We can prioritize this idea of community-centered resistance, sustain our cultural heritage and autonomy, come together doing the things that Black folks do unapologetically, even if it's a damn barbecue. Have that cookout and don't invite the others to the cookout, proverbially or literally. And we can recognize matriarchal leadership in these movements for justice. I've mentioned it. That's been the missing through thread in a lot of the work that has been done and the uh, civil rights movements that have been done here in the US. Minimizing Black women's voices has made that unstable or unstable. Black Lives Matters was um, a shift away from that, having been led and highly involved Black women. And even that, received attacks and um, In some cases, lack of support within our communities because of that. We really got to get over that and understand what is that rift? What is this discontent? I have some theories, but this video ain't about that. But what is this discontent that our own people have with Black women? That's a bigger question. But in order for us to move forward, recognize the power of women in the matriarchal leadership. Bring us into the picture. So overall, what does this sacred resistance, as we summarize this whole week of looking at different forms of resistance, whether it's using our voice spoken, using our voice in speeches, using our voice in music and in art, using our voice in terms of written words, using armed resistance. What are all of the things that we've been through and talked about this week? Different forms of resistance that each of us has a responsibility and an obligation to play a role in resisting what's happening now, because history does not start and then stop. We are living in the continuum of the same timeline. We are living in the continuum from Queen Nanny, Dutty Boukman, and Cecile Fatiman, Toussaint Louverture. We are living in the continuum, and it goes back even further than that. So we all have a part to play in this resistance to actually fully get the full mind, body, spirit, and let me say it in correct order, whichever spirit, mind, body, liberation that we are all seeking, that has been a multi hundreds of year process. And we are in the latest episode of that. What we going to do? How do we contribute to the resistance? We can create movements led by disciplined strategic leadership that plans for life beyond resistance. That's visionary leadership. That's visionary servant leadership, to quote my sister, Dr. Belazaire, so that we can actually have sustainable freedom, not something short term, not something that pacifies us for now, not something that lets some people, some Black folks, get to call themselves middle class, get to get a few degrees, get to feel like they have more than the others, but true leadership that moves us towards liberation for all of us. We look at reclaiming ancestral spiritual systems as a foundation for collective strength and action in whatever way that means for you. Because spiritual practices are tools of resistance. All of these sacred resistance ancestors have shown us this week. And we can look at building movements that protect cultural identity, community autonomy, and elevate the leadership of women and marginalized voices. We can't say we free if we still suppressing somebody else. Everybody got to be free. Everyone has to be valued. Again, Haitian Revolution was kicked off, started, implemented, initiated with a man and a woman doing a spiritual ceremony, both together, co-led. And it was the only successful slave uprising on this planet, and it was led with masculine energy and feminine energy combined. And by the way, the woman that did that lived to be 112 years old. We have to understand the impact and what Spirit is telling us very clearly. You can't move forward without women. There's stories and proverbs and itans and pakatis. These are words from the spiritual African traditions. But anyway, there are stories that talk about, without me going into detail, that talk about nothing will work on this planet until women are acknowledged and involved and respected. This is words, this is wisdom that goes back to the continent from all of our ancestors, that folks are still not applying and understanding the true impact of what that means. And we're seeing it play out over and over and over again over hundreds of years. And people that will quote that same story turn around and do the same damn thing that they're talking about in the story about feminine energy being ignored. So, cultural sovereignty and gendered leadership has to be a part of how we move forward. Also, again, a theme that has been brought up every day this week as we talked about sacred resistance. Whoo, take a deep breath, y'all. Thank y'all for riding with me on this sacred resistance week that's part of this 28-day ancestral activation for Black liberation. 21 days in, y'all. We got one more week, 7 more days. We'll get back here tomorrow as we go into sacred restoration. Each day and for the next 7 days, we're going to talk about two ancestors because sacred restoration, as we have seen and heard these last 3 weeks, we as a people been through so much. We have multiple layers and levels of healing to do. That's our responsibility to do. No one's going to magically come in and heal us for us. We got to do it. But we have some ancestors that have done work in different categories, different capacities that we can look to guide us and to bring us wisdom on how to go about that and how to look at it that's specific to us because each of us are our own individual. So we'll go into that starting tomorrow. And and then we'll be complete with this 28 days. And the next thing I think just after today or at any point, as I mentioned before, with all of the other sacred lineage and sacred shields, there was a meditation to really connect with the wisdom that was at the end of each ancestral veneration or honoring presentation that we went through. For this week, because sacred resistance was so broad and can be, and it was especially for me, there was a lot of energy. It was a lot of heaviness. There was a lot of death that took place in order to resist. So instead of doing that each day, I created a separate meditation to really connect with those three characteristics that showed up all week: love, courage, and action. And then specifically some of the wisdom from each of the ancestors that we've talked about this week. That's already up. I posted that a couple of days ago. It's in the playlist. You can find it there. I will go back in after this month because it's bothering me and correct how I say Dutty Boukman because I think I said Duty Bookman. Um, but for now, please overlook that. He has already forgiven me, and but I ain't forgiven myself, so I'm gonna go back and correct that later after I get through and recover from these 28 days. So join me here tomorrow. Let's, don't, whenever I go through things, and I do this in all of my books and in the work, you have to do the restoration part. After we look at the brutal truth, and understand and go through the tears and expose the trauma so that it can be healed, we actually have to do the work to heal it. We can't just leave it open and exposed. So join me here, either live or by replay. Got seven days to come on in, and we're going to look at multiple different aspects of healing and ancestors that worked in those different aspects. The lives are already scheduled, so you can go in and see what we're going to be talking about and go from there. Let's take one more deep breath. Have a beautiful rest of your day. Please leave comments and share and do all the things so that this information, these insights, this wisdom can make it to other folks. I thank you for being here, and I will see you tomorrow as well, Dr. Belizaire. Until then, and as always, I just want to show this one. Take good care of you.